Please.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I move the motion standing on my name in the notice paper relating to refugee community sponsorship.
The question is the motion be agreed to, Mr Rattenbury.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'd like to start this morning by recognising and celebrating people who have come to Canberra as refugees and to recognise their contributions to building our community, be it through sporting teams, volunteering, community groups, local small businesses and the other myriad of ways that they contribute to our city. I note that the ACT is a refugee welcome zone and that we have a well-established commitment to supporting and encouraging refugees to settle here. In fact, over the past 10 years, in Canberra we have welcomed over 2,000 refugees to the Territory. We are a proud multicultural city. I note the large proportion of the Canberra community that came together last month to celebrate the annual and very popular Multicultural Festival in the city. I would also like to acknowledge yesterday as the UN Day for elimination of all forms of racial discrimination, ahead of the nationwide Palm Sunday rallies for refugees this weekend, organised in Canberra by the Refugee Action Committee. The Greens remain committed to supporting refugees who have lost their own homes, loved ones and livelihoods, and yet remain hopeful and show great courage in seeking new opportunities, new communities and new foundations on which to rebuild their lives and those of their families. I want to start with a recap of the current circumstances for asylum seekers in Australia. Based on data from the Department of Home Affairs, the Refugee Council of Australia has calculated that on the 31st of January this year, there were 1,287 people in detention facilities. I have previously spoken in this place about the need to bring refugees to the ACT and the other 148 welcome zones across Australia. I think it is important to acknowledge that the ACT Assembly last year supported my motion calling for the federal government to close the offshore detention centres on Manus Island and Nauru and instead support refugees and asylum seekers being processed in the community, where we know that there are communities across this country willing to accept them. I think that the ACT community would be pleased to know that these are the kinds of issues that this Assembly can work together to truly represent our local community on. In fact, some of the advocates are here in the chamber today and I welcome them to the Assembly and thank them for their ongoing support in this matter over many years now of advocating on behalf of refugees seeking asylum in Australia. I am heartened that the Community Support Program may offer additional means to bring refugees to Australia, including to Canberra. As I have clearly stated in my motion today, the Community Support Program needs to be additional to the 1,650 places already allocated to Australia's broader humanitarian intake program. The Greens want to join Amnesty International in calling out this clear flaw in the program, which essentially sees it as an opportunity to shift costs rather than the far more positive potential to encourage and facilitate individuals and community groups to support refugees to join their communities. A 4-year pilot of the Community Support Program has demonstrated unwavering demand in spite of costs and strict criteria, successfully reaching its yearly intake capacity of 500 people. A backlog of applications from the pilot alone are expected to fill 40% of the quota for this year's maximum intake of 1,000 refugees. In practice, what is happening is that families, often newly arrived in Australia themselves, are willing to go into debt to afford the exorbitant fees in their desperation to be reunited with family members. Although this program is considerably more affordable than the Family Reunion Visa program, which is substantially oversubscribed, it's important to note that the Family Reunion program is open to all migrants and the Community Support Program is intended to target those who are most in need. As I said earlier, the Greens wholeheartedly support the Community Support Program, but the criteria are alarming, and the fact that refugees in this program are being included in Australia's humanitarian intake limit is simply inequitable. It is creating classes of refugees, those who can afford to apply, those who have found sponsors who can afford to pay, and those who simply can't afford it. I have included a fair bit of detail around the criteria in the motion text itself in order to give members sufficient background to consider this matter, and I believe that it speaks for itself. Our humanitarian intake should be just that, humanitarian. It shouldn't mean that we require people to already have an offer of employment be within a young working age, and have a clear pathway to ensure that they are financially self-sufficient within 12 months of arrival, let alone having access to $16,444 plus $2,680 for each other family just for visa application fees, as well as funding airfares, medical screening and settlement costs. The fact that you don't even get the $2,680 back if your visa application is rejected is also appalling in these circumstances. These aren't business migration program applicants from people who are comfortable in their home country and can possibly afford it. These are people who are desperate. They are seeking asylum. I also find it disturbing that the program reduces the level of New Start payment that refugees would receive while they're waiting for their applications to be processed. It's unclear to me why their lifestyles would be any cheaper than any other unemployed person, especially as they are presumably arriving in Australia with basically nothing, and New Start is not a comfortable amount to live on in general anyway. If we want to have a program with these criteria, that's one thing, but they shouldn't be in place for people who should be part of our humanitarian intake. Not only does this program place considerable hardship on families, it shows that it is not necessarily targeting those most in need. It's also becoming clear that the federal government's aim of widening the scope of the program beyond family repatriation, as in the bulk of cases under the pilot program, is not well targeted either. The Community Support Program allows for community sponsorship of refugees via approved proposing organisations, or APOs, which can be individuals, community groups or businesses. It is intended that these APOs would have the skills and experience to manage the application and settlement process on behalf of visa applicants and their Australian supporters. However, as yet, more than 6 months into the program, there are still no APOs. Yet until APOs have been appointed, individual visa applications cannot be lodged. The government's intention to widen the scope of the program by attracting business support appears to be falling flat. This seems to be backed up with these significant delays in appointing and announcing the necessary APOs. It would be unsurprising if the high application costs are a factor in businesses' hesitation to engage with the program, which raises a key issue. If the private sector is not keen to pay the high upfront costs, then individuals and the community sector are likely to be even more significantly priced out. The idea that this program seeks to save the federal government an estimated $26.9 million over 4 years is contemptuous. This is a considerable cost burden for the community, while for the federal government it is a drop in the ocean. For comparison, this amounts to approximately 0.6% of the Department of Home Affairs departmental spending on border enforcement. Our local community groups can only do so much. These changes to eligibility for Status Resolution Support Service places increasing pressure on individuals and community groups. My colleague Ms Lakuta and I have met with some of the organisations that work so hard to support refugees who come to Canberra. The Status Resolution Support Service criteria are not transparent, so it's difficult to determine. But anecdotal evidence tells us that if families have sent more than $1,000 overseas in the past 12 months, they are not eligible for the payment. This seems to be applied to onshore applicants who may have made the payments to family back in their home country well before making an application for asylum. There are increasing numbers of families in the ACT who are applying to the federal court to appeal rejection of their applications, but families who appeal to the courts are then ineligible for any federal government income support. This is coupled with increasing delays in federal court appeal processes. For many refugees, the timeframes for this are increasing towards 2 years from the time of lodging an appeal to receiving a verdict. Clearly, the courts are overloaded with these applications, and it is unreasonable to expect those already vulnerable people to wait out the process without any prospect of eligibility for what is essentially a safety net payment. These are people who are trying their very best to integrate into the community and support themselves. They are seeking out employment and education opportunities and balancing family caring responsibilities for children. The experience for at least some families is that they are not able to get enough work to support themselves, are working towards qualifications to improve work prospects, and faced with other practical barriers such as going through the process to obtain a driver's licence. Our community groups, such as Canberra Refugee Support, are endeavouring to support these families as they have seen the contributions to the community that have been made by those who were supported over previous decades, who now have tenacious commitment to education and loyalty to the Australian communities who supported them at their time of need. There is clear evidence of the disproportionate contribution made by our community to prop up a system that is failing some of the most vulnerable people on this planet, whose only fault is being born in the wrong place at the wrong time. In New South Wales, St Vincent de Paul's asylum seeker program focuses on providing support to those at judicial review and ministerial intervention stages of their claim for asylum. These refugees are having to rely on charity from neighbours, local churches and community groups to meet their basic living costs. It is a shame that the federal government is relying on the community to plug holes as they arise from what we can only assume are ill thought out, or perhaps, and worse still, deliberately punitive measures to reduce support for asylum seekers. If we step aside from this Australian program for a moment and look afar to Canada, we can see a model on how we could do things differently. Their model provides a clear example of how community sponsorship can be done without overly burdening communities and at the same time improving mechanisms for refugees to seek safety when their home country cannot provide it. The Canadian program has been working for 40 years, welcoming over 280,000 people through community-led sponsorship. The Canadian program is in addition to the government-supported humanitarian intake. While the community must still prove its ability to provide financial support to refugees they sponsor, there is no upfront application cost, and after 18 months of successful program participation, applicants have access to social security support payments. A joint discussion paper by the Refugee Council of Australia and Settlement Services International illustrates the success of the Canadian model since its inception in the 1970s. They say that it is achieved at minimal cost to the Canadian government and provides a model which can be adapted in many other countries as part of global efforts to respond to the pressing need for more resettlement places. And they also found the differences in employment and income between privately sponsored and government-assisted refugees are significant in the early years in Canada, but over 10 years, as outcomes for all refugees improve, this gap becomes much smaller. I hope that in writing to the federal government, we may be able to influence them to look more closely at the Canadian model and improve the criteria of the community sponsorship program. Madam Speaker, in conclusion, I would like to thank Amnesty for bringing this matter to our attention. I understand they have spoken to all parties in this place about this issue over recent weeks. I would also like to thank them for their tireless efforts to uphold the values of inclusion and fairness in our society and holding governments to account in such important areas as refugee rights and human rights in Australia and overseas. I would also like to thank Canberra Refugee Support, a lesser known but very important group of caring and compassionate people who continue to advocate for and support refugees in our local community, not just at the beginning, but when they need it most, when many other sources of support have been exhausted. I have confidence that our Canberra community will continue to support refugees, and the Greens would like to see the federal government supporting the goodwill and generosity of Canberrans by implementing a well-targeted, equitable and inclusive community refugee sponsorship program. I hope to see this call echoed in our fellow refugee welcome zones across Australia. I commend this motion to the Assembly.
Thank you. Members of the gallery, please. Question is the motion.